Hey guys, what's up? Welcome to another episode of the Coach Cody podcast. So today I have a special guest, which I've had on my YouTube channel before back in 2020. So like super long time ago. So this is someone that introduced me to religious trauma, like my first kind of contact or where I got information. I believe I attended like a little online seminar that you did. And I was just like, I need to talk to this person. Anyways, so today we have Dr. Laura Anderson, all things religious trauma expert. And I'll let you introduce yourself because like I told you before, I don't want to mess up the intro. You do so much. So yeah, tell us about yourself.
Hi. Well, it's good to be here. And I feel like we've connected so many times that I didn't even realize how long ago it was that we first met and did our first episode together, which why so much has happened since then. But yeah, I am a licensed psychotherapist in the state of Tennessee. And I also have a practice. It's an online trauma coaching company called the Center for Trauma Resolution and Recovery, which was my solution for being able to work with people all over, well, truly all over the world, especially, but I would say most of our clients are based out of the United States using the coaching format. And so I have about 15 other people that work alongside me doing trauma coaching. And we specialize in all things religious trauma, cults, fundamentalism, spiritual abuse, purity culture, high control religions, relationships, all the, super easy, fun, light stuff that, many people are dealing with. So on top of that, I also am an author. I just, I say just published, but almost a year ago, published my first book, When Religion Hurts You, which is available wherever you buy books. And I'm trying to think if there's other things I do. I'm sure there are, but, I consult with people. I do podcasts. I have my own podcast, the Sunday School Dropouts, which you've been on. So, that's like a little bit. And then in between all of that, I try to be a human and sleep and eat and, be outside and work out and all the things. So, that's the tip of the iceberg version of me.
Which is a lot. I feel like one of the other things I'm just like, how does she do all of that? Like writing a book and like running your own I work with really cool things. I work with really great people. I have not only the coaches that I work with, but the staff and support staff behind the scenes. I have lucked out with people that are not only incredible in their fields, but passionate about religious trauma. And so I have amazing people around me that I can delegate to, and it works. That's good. That's always good. Otherwise, probably, drive yourself a little crazy. So
just a little,
help. So religious trauma, I guess, for folks who are not familiar with it, we might want to go over just base definition. So what is religious trauma? How did you kind of, dive deeper into this and really find it as your passion and just how did you end up where you are today?
Yeah. Well, my personal life definitely inspires my professional life. So I grew up in a high control religion, was like born into it. I do not remember a single day of my life not being a part of that religious group. My dad was a director at a fundamentalist Christian camp, which we lived on site at. And so not only, was I going to church whenever the doors were open, but then we were just completely immersed in it, every day. And on the one hand, living at a camp is kind of fun, right? Because you have access to lakes and horses and ropes courses and all the things, but it's also very isolating. There's a lot of dress codes and relationship codes and, things that you can and cannot do. And especially then as the daughter of a director, there's a lot of pressure there to show up in a very specific way. So that was my upbringing, and also grew up in the thick of purity culture, which I know know all about. And so I was born, I was kind of in it when it was like really coming into the secular forefront. So the True Love Waits back in 1994, I think dear little middle school self was like, yeah, sure, I'll sign away my virginity to my future spouse. And I was like, not even like understanding what that could be. I was a late bloomer. I'm attracted to men, and boys still had cooties back then. So, I'm just like, I don't know, sure, I'll guess they'll like sign my name. So, but I grew up then. That was like part of then very, very formative in my upbringing, which of course, everything from what is a woman to how do I dress and act, how do I relate to others. It's obviously very strict binary genders, sexuality. So that was just, how I grew up. When I graduated, I wanted to go off to college, but I also knew that my life was supposed to be as a wife and a mother, because that was my whole purpose in life as I had been taught. So I did that. I wasn't the wife and mother, but I decided to not go off to college and instead stayed. I began working professionally in ministry. That was a very spiritually abusive environment. It ultimately led me out of ministry, still in the faith, but that's what got me into therapy, as like in training to be a therapist. And as soon as I was done with my therapy degree, I knew that I had a skill that I could take to anywhere, rather than just having my ministry degree, which was very limiting for me as a woman and as somebody, who is not the quiet and submissive one. I knew that I would never have a chance to like really do anything, but having a therapy degree allowed me to move anywhere in the country and essentially start over. I had started asking questions, like really asking questions about my faith, the first day that I was in my master's degree program. But I had to keep it under wraps. I had been asking questions before then, but I'd been suppressing them. My first day of my master's degree program was when a question bubbled up to the surface, and for the first time I didn't push it down and I just let it come out, and it literally changed everything. And ultimately that's what got me here. I moved to Nashville, Tennessee. I began working in community mental health and eventually transitioned to a private practice. Here in the South, we, it's like, what church you go to is the next question asked after what is your name. It is just part of the culture. So I wasn't advertising myself as this, religious trauma therapist, but I would have clients coming into my office talking about the things that had happened to them, what they were being triggered by, feeling very confused that they had left religion cognitively, but that their bodies were still having physiological responses to things like music or old doctrine and teachings, the relationships they were having with their family. I was at the same time still deconstructing my own faith and healing from my own religious trauma, but eventually I outpaced my clients a little bit, so I wasn't, kind of in lockstep. And after several years of doing it, I started to feel much more comfortable, not only with those clients, but then advertising myself as a religious trauma therapist, somebody who specialized in this. And that's what kind of changed everything. I got in contact with other therapists who are doing similar work. I started to show up in social media spaces, creating resources for people and for clinicians. And then the pandemic hit. That's when we met. Yep. And we had this, massive outflux of people coming out of high control religions and starting to talk about it as a result of the elections, the 2016 elections, and everything that was happening since. A huge amount of disillusionment of people that had grown up in these systems, who had given their lives and every fiber of their beings to these systems, beliefs, churches, doctrines, everything, going, what is going on here? And the need for support was enormous. And so I tried. I did my best, but I'm one person, and eventually my waiting list got so long. It was about 4 years long, that I just couldn't be like, hey, I can see you in summer of 2024. That just about like highly unethical to me. And that's what led me to open up my company. It's what somehow my literary agent found me on social media, and she said, I love what you're doing. We need a resource. I think you're the one to write it. And a few years later, here is a company and a book and all the things, and being able to be somebody who's kind of on the forefront of having that religious trauma conversation. And so then that leads me back to that idea of like, what is religious trauma? And the simplest way that I can say it is religious trauma is trauma. We are working on a more succinct definition for it. I do have it in my book. But at the end of the day, religious trauma is trauma. The word religious is a bit of an adjective that just helps us better understand or describe where the trauma resulted from, where the overwhelm, the danger, the real and perceived threats were coming from. And so trauma is anything that is too much, too fast, too soon, overwhelms our ability to cope and come back to a place of safety. And so then religious trauma is anything that's happening in those contexts, whether it is the doctrines and the beliefs, the services, the people, the institution of the church, the restrictive, rules and everything like that, that just overwhelms our ability to cope and come back to a place of safety. So yeah, there's another tip of the iceberg, but leading into more of what is religious trauma.
Yeah. It's, I guess the biggest thing too is like, so when it comes to religious trauma and everything that contributes to it, I guess, like, how do we, there's people who are still in the church and like, do we just kind of assume maybe at some point they're going to be like, they're going to feel the effects of it? Or like, I don't know. That was a weird question, but how does it work for someone just realizes like how much religion has impacted them? Like what makes it be like, that's religious trauma? Is there anything, is it just like how much distress it causes them, or, yeah.
Yeah, trauma is very subjective to every person. So what is traumatic for you may or may not be for me, and vice versa. And everybody's body handles things very differently. So I have siblings who grew up in the exact same environment that I did, with the same teachings and the same parents and the same environments. And how they're impacted is different than how I was impacted. Now, some of them are still in the church, and I think that as they go through their own deconstruction processes, though I don't know that they would call it that, they're starting to see, oh, wow, this impacted me in some very significant ways. But like 5 years ago, they were not able to see that because they were still so in it. And I think it's important to realize that like not everybody coming out of these high control religions is going to experience trauma. The result is not going to be trauma. There's a whole other thing, a whole lot of other things that could, you could experience as a result: mental health disorders, dis-ease, physical, issues, autoimmune issues. Trauma is one of many things that could result from things like this. And of course, there are people that can walk away relatively unscathed as well, and bless them, because they weren't real Christians. No, I'm just kidding.
I've definitely thought that myself. I'm just like, yeah. I feel like everyone walks around like they didn't expect me to follow the rules.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
Was I the only one doing what I was supposed to?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so, when we're coming out of these systems, so first of all, it's very hard to sometimes recognize it when you're in the system, right? Because you are immersed in it, and there's a very heavy price that you will pay to push back, ask questions, leave, anything like that. Like I said, I was asking questions for a long time, but I was suppressing them because I knew that if I continued asking the questions, that I wasn't going to get favorable answers, and I knew that the consequences would be very, very high, including but not limited to being cut out, disconnected from the community. My salvation would be called into question. My character would be called into question. I would be a dangerous woman. Turns out I was, but whatever. It's a title that I wear proudly now.
Yes.
But yeah, so when we're in that system, we oftentimes cannot realize either what is happening to us or the severity of what is happening to us. And it's only when we start to get a little bit of distance, or things get so bad, usually in a very overt way, that people start going, hold on here. What's actually happening? I need to think through this. And as they begin to distance themselves, that's where they sometimes notice the physiological symptoms that come up. I would say for most people, how their entry into religious trauma healing usually comes from cognitive deconstruction, asking those questions, starting to notice that things aren't lining up. And then they might get a certain distance away, and all of a sudden the physiological symptoms start to show up, which feels very counterintuitive, because it's like, oh, as I get away from that, as I don't practice, as I'm safe, like my body should be like, cool, this is great. But that's when our bodies are finally having the chance to kind of relax, and everything that we've been holding in for days, weeks, months, years, decades starts to come out. And we do see things like physical distress, but also anxiety, OCD, depression, autoimmune disorders, relational difficulties, boundaries issues, communication, and trauma, you know?
Yeah, it's a whole list of things.
Yeah.
It's funny because I think I don't know if we're ready to look at the silver lining yet, but I feel like with the Trump presidency, hopefully we don't have to experience that again, but dear God. Anyways, I wonder how much that led to like a mass deconstruction, just because people who actually were able to recognize that he does not align with any of the Christian beliefs, and it's like complete opposite of what we were taught like is a good Christian man, on all levels, just non-existent. So I feel like the disconnect there, some people were able to recognize that, and that's when it like got people questioning more and more, and I feel like that's when deconstruction kind of exploded. Like is that something that you've noticed? Because I can't like, I'm like, when did this kind of start? And I feel like that's kind of was the catalyst, but
well, I do think it's worth noting that us former religious folks do not have the corner market on the concept of deconstruction. That has been around for hundreds of years. Jacques Derrida is the philosopher who came up with that term and concept. We're just using it now as a way to describe this experience of kind of untangling what it is that we've gone through. But I do think that the 2015 leading into the 2016 election cycle is what caught a lot of people off guard and had them pausing, like you're saying. I can think of my deconstruction process that started officially back in like 2007, but really started probably back in about 2002. I thought I was the only one. Right? Social media wasn't a thing. And I don't mean in like an egotistical way, but we weren't talking about this. And we were made to believe that if we have questions and doubts, that's a me problem. Certainly not a problem with the system, the doctrine, the pastor, the whomever. Right? And so I think what happened in 2016 is that there was all these people with questions, and then there was a way to talk about it so that you didn't feel like you were alone. Enter Twitter. That's where so many of these conversations started happening, and people started talking about the impacts of purity culture and specifics within it, like the I Kiss Dating Goodbye book and that whole mentality. People started talking about, hey, this dude that my pastor is endorsing does not match the Jesus that I was taught about, or the type of person I was supposed to be. And now people have a platform for it. Now people have a way of discussing. So I think that social media played a huge role in why it's at where it is today. And so for as much as social media can be so frustrating and taxing and overwhelming and ridiculous, there is something also, I think, life-saving about it. And I don't have the exact data as to like what is the percentage of people that exited during that point, but I do know that the rise of the religious nuns, NONES, like having no affiliation with a religion, having left a religion, being disillusioned from religion, has drastically increased since the election. And so I think that while they might not all identify as ex-religious or even religious in the first place, I think that we can assume that the enormous increase in that is due to people coming out of high control religions due to the 2016 election. Yeah.
And then currently, with facing, Trump running again, and you still have Christian right very much so endorsing him. There's a small percentage that is not and can still point it out, and like they're still Christians or whatever, but just maybe don't lack empathy or something along those lines. So it's like you see the Christian nationalism, and especially if you're on Twitter or X or whatever the fuck we want to call it now,
Yeah.
it is strong. Like it is mostly
Strong.
there's a big contrast between like X and Threads. I feel way more at ease.
I love it.
I'm like,
It's
hey, it's
so
not
fun.
people.
I know. I love scrolling Threads. It's
too.
so fun because it's just like delightful. I don't know.
is.
It's just like it's so enjoyable. Yes, huge disparity between those two platforms.
Yeah, and it's like X just became like this kind of conservative Christian or like far right mass
Dumpster
like,
fire.
my whole feed is just like anti-trans stuff, anti-LGBT stuff, you know, like Trump stuff, and I'm like, I didn't even sign up for this. Why am I even seeing this? It's just so just infiltrated on there. But I guess, you know, the biggest thing, like I know right now I am more triggered than ever just because it is so loud. And I guess, you know, like how do you know, how does that affect you? Like what do you feel inside when you see these things? Do you still like get mad, or like does it rile you up, or are you kind of like chill with it? So yeah, how do you handle that?
It's a weird thing that's happening because I think for those of us who grew up in it, we and left, right? We left and said, I'm out. Finally, I'm free from all of that. So to be here 8 years later in the 2024 election cycle and seeing all of this stuff that was what we grew up with now being proposed as national policy and legislation, to hear, you know, political leaders and news commentators and whatever going, yeah, this is what we should do. I think it can feel disillusioning and terrifying and so discouraging. Like I left all of that and now you're telling me that I'm supposed to embrace this as a nation. I also find it to be so interesting that there, you know, I frequently have to remind myself that like not everybody grew up the way that we did. And so how they see the world and, you know, their perspectives and whatever, like it's not through that lens, right? Which is good. Like we should give people permission to be like, oh yeah, you didn't grow up like me, so of course you would see things different, you know, whatever. But I think with that, like there is a level of seriousness that people should take us because, you know, they're going, oh, these are just these fringe religious people that are kind of popping onto the scene. And we all know that that's not the case. We know that they've been playing the long game for over 70 years to get us to where this point is today. And so I was listening to a podcast with a couple friends of mine as the hosts, and they did not, they grew up, or they were involved in a cult, but it was not a religious cult and they didn't grow up religious. And one of the hosts said something to the effect of like, yeah, I hadn't even like heard of this for like the last year or something. Is this something we should be worried about? And I was like, oh my God, yes. Like, yes, like this is a big, big deal. People don't understand the level of what Christian nationalism is trying to do and how they are trying to control people and take away rights of anybody who's not a cis straight white man. Like that's anybody who falls below that threshold has varying levels of rights and humanity that are about to be stripped if these people get into power. And I don't think people understand the gravity of what that could be because they're just write these people off as these fringe religious people that don't have much power when in reality it can be terrifying. So how I deal with it, I go on Threads. I live for the memes, right? I will say I felt so much more hope in the last few weeks since Kamala took over the Democratic ticket, and I have a particular fondness for Tim Walz, being somebody who is from Minnesota. There's a lightness and humanity that is starting to come back. And it's been nice to see people getting on board because though the quote unquote fight is not over, it feels like there's some momentum to combat it. So that feels really good. But at the same time, I also have to take a lot of breaks, because this is something that I do professionally in working with my clients and supporting other practitioners and consulting on cases where people are massively triggered during this election cycle for all the reasons that we've mentioned. So I try to create resources and support where I can. And then I also have to take breaks myself and just, whether it's shutting social media off, phone off, watching The Bachelor, other ridiculous reality TV.
Yes.
That's where I live right now.
Yeah, breaks are definitely necessary, or else it really gets to you. So it's funny because it's just like, I think, maybe the people that didn't grow up religious, maybe they don't take it as seriously just because they don't, like you said, they don't think that way. It's just like, I grew up, Christian school, going to church, and like Christian nationalism is not new. It's just like, duh, they've been trying to do this forever. It's like, we always were influenced as kids, even who to vote for, Republican, like I was
always
mostly like Bush era, and it was always like defending Bush, praying for the president, and all that stuff. And so it's its own type of grooming, for sure, its own type of indoctrination. And since I know how deep that runs, that's why I'm like, you guys, this is so scary. But then also, it's why it makes me like so aggravated and riles me up, because I'll get told that, I get told to stay away from kids, not to indoctrinate kids, not to share my story because I'm trans, because I could be, kids are watching and I wouldn't want to give them ideas. And I always just like to remind people of being like, look, I grew up in a Christian school. I went to church every Sunday. I didn't learn a single thing about sexuality, sex in general, or gender. And guess what? Like, I'm still trans. So it's not like contagious, but also no one gives a fuck about the indoctrination of kids when it comes to religion. Like, how is that okay? And I just want to be like screaming from the rooftops of being like, you have no idea how much this harmed me, and I do not want that to happen to anyone else. And of course it's going to, but like, that's one of my biggest pet peeves. I'm like, you have no idea the potential damage that this is doing, but you can't see it because it's like, you invite it, you want this, you want your kids to be indoctrinated with this, you're not even giving them options. So like, that's the thing that riles me up the most. I feel like it's just so one-sided, and the cognitive dissonance is just insane.
Yeah, absolutely. There is an amount of compassion that I have for quote unquote that side, in the sense that they really do believe that what they're doing is right. It's coming from an ignorantly malicious place. We'll say that, right? like it's malicious, right? But they're totally ignorant to that, because there's a true belief that this is God's plan, God's will. This is what we have to do. This is what we're commanded to do. This is how we save the world. Now, for as much as I disagree wholeheartedly with all of that, because of the way I grew up, you grew up, it's like, I can have an amount of empathy or compassion for understanding where they're coming from, even though I don't agree with it. But I think that's why it makes somebody like you or I more fervent in our passion to be like, this is fucked up. I'm sorry, I don't know if I can swear, but
no, you can
but
swear
this
all
is
you want.
it's, okay. It's messed up. We know on a lived experience level, as well as the people that we talk to, work with, everything like that, how it impacts us. And I think that's, I mean, it's hard to hold both of those like together, because we also know that the way we combat that, like if we're going to them with conversations, quote unquote arguments, challenging, like that is not actually going to get through to them. That is only going to fuel the fire that this is not only the right thing that they are doing, but this is Christian persecution. And so they're already expecting it. So it affirms the narrative that they have already been, sold, that, we believed that, right? And so it can feel really hopeless. And this is like the slow process and doesn't get fast change. But for me personally, I have found that the biggest way to combat that is in my personal relationships, like the people that I can have the one-on-one relationships with, and just showing up as myself in a kind and authentic way. I have family members that are still in it. And when I finally told that, this was years ago now, that, this is not something I believe, I'm not, I don't consider myself to be a part of this anymore. They were very, hands off, skeptical, I got some, responses of like, please don't proselytize to us. You told us we can't do that to you, but please don't do that to us either, which I never would have done. And comments about like, you're somebody we can't trust, you're a dangerous person, right? All the normal stuff that we would have said to somebody also. And I knew that was coming, and so it didn't bother me, but I just kept showing up as myself, as my kind self, as my authentic self, as my interested self. I never made fun of anything that they believed. I never bashed their faith. And slowly over time, the relationships have like evolved into really beautiful conversations and asking questions and curiosity. And now I'm the first one that some of my family members call when something is going on, when they have a problem, when they need support, which they don't call their Christian family members. They call me, and they've told me it's because I know you won't judge me. It's because I know you'll offer support. It's because I know you'll show up for me. And that I'm just like, that is the biggest compliment have ever received. And that is the slow game. And it doesn't work for everybody. I realize that. And especially I can recognize my own privilege as a cis white woman, that I'm not having to fight for my life in certain ways that other people are. And so maybe I can have a more patience oriented response because my literal like rights aren't on the line all the time. So I realize that that's not always something that is afforded to people. And yet I think that relationship is the only way that people actually change.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And it's funny how we have to like reverse
reverse missionary like dating. Yeah,
it's just like, wow, this is the same but different.
Yeah,
it's just like, just show them love, like Jesus is love without the Jesus.
Right. Yeah, there's no agenda to it though. That's the best part, is there's no agenda. Like, I'm not trying to be nice to you so that I can sell you a message. I'm going to be kind to you because that's who I am, and I'm going to keep being kind to you even if you still believe all that stuff.
Yeah, which is not usually the Christian take. It's like they're not allowed, like if you don't convert, they're like, we got to go, sorry, we can't hang out with you.
Bye.
Bad influence, can't do it. So I think one of the things that usually, something I've struggled with, and I know a lot of people probably do, is it feels so easily gaslighted, especially with, if you still have family that is in the church and then you're claiming to be traumatized by the thing that maybe is still their priority and their love and they're just fully invested still. And it can leave you feeling a little nutty. And then you feel like maybe you're the crazy one because you are struggling from everything and everyone else is fine. And at the same time in their brains, they're just like, this is Satan's doing. You're letting the devil get to you. Yeah. And that's always their go-to. It's like, this is Satan's whispering in your ear and they're just praying for you to come back. And you're like, so how do you deal with that side of things?
Yeah, I think the gaslighting aspect is baked into the system. And it's part of a control tactic. I don't think they would call it gaslighting, but it's part of a control tactic. And I would, this is like a little soapbox I'll die on really quickly. This idea of self-gaslighting, I do not agree with, because by definition, gaslighting is something that's been done by somebody else or somebody's else, multiple people. But so when we're like, when we say like, oh, I'm self-gaslighting, I would actually invite people to consider like, no, I'm not self-gaslighting, but those are the messages that I've been indoctrinated, brainwashed to believe that are coming back. It's those voices, those people. That's what still is gaslighting me, because their voices are the ones that are the loudest in my mind right now, which actually then can offer a little bit more sense of empowerment as we're going, okay, what is my choice here in this situation? Do I want to listen to that? Or is there something else that I can do, listen to, lean on, things like that, different support? And I think just knowing, sometimes even knowing that piece and knowing that there is choice and power can be helpful, but also recognizing that like, it may be something that we always come back and touch on at different points in our lives. We're like, oh gosh, what if they are right? And to not shame and judge ourselves in those moments, because that it's part of the impact of that system is to get us to doubt and to question ourselves, and to teach us that any questions that we have are a reflection of us, again, versus the system. So, when it comes to our families, I am a big proponent of boundaries. In some cases, that means we have to go no contact, but in other cases, it means that we might have to have some really clearly defined boundaries around the time that we spend with them, the conversations we have with them, the things that are maybe off the table in terms of conversing with them. What is my exit strategy? What are the ways that I can support myself when I am in contact with them? Are they people that for right now, this season in my life, I need to refrain from phone contact, but I could do text contact with? Or is it where I can be in public with them, maybe out to eat and not at somebody's home? And so kind of developing like, what are some boundaries so that I can feel safe? Boundaries are for us. It's our job to identify what they are and to implement them. Our families are probably going to keep being our families, right? There's probably going to not be a lot of movement, especially in the short term, by being like, you idiot, you're gaslighting me. Like they're not going to receive that well, right?
Yeah.
So if we can let go of that expectation with grief and allow ourselves to feel the grief of that, because of course, like that is really difficult and sad, and I don't want to bypass that. And also with that grief then comes this place of acceptance, meaning I have to realize this is how it's going to be, but what do I want to do to keep myself safe in these situations? And I think that can be really helpful and leads a little bit more down the road towards empowerment rather than constantly doubting yourself, feeling shame, blame, guilt, all those fun sorts of things.
Yeah. And it's always, it's always hard too, because it takes a lot of, I feel like, practice. To not be like reactive. It's like when it's first fresh, it's harder to just not be triggered by everything. So it's like for anyone who's new to the deconstruction process, it gets better.
It does. And it's always going to be the hardest with your family. It just, and that doesn't even matter if you're coming from a high control religion background or anything like that. All of us as humans, when we, if we have families that aren't, necessarily the healthiest or have our quirks or, whatever, like our tendency always is to fall back into the roles and patterns of how we navigated our upbringing years. So if we were the clown, if we were the hero, if we were the, whatever, when we get in front of family, it's very normal and natural to like kind of slide back into that role, because our body is used to being in that role. It's a very familiar role for survival to navigate. And so when we add then the high control religion component on it, and now we're with family who is very much in that world, even if we've been out of it for 20 years, it still can sometimes feel really difficult to not get triggered, to not, slide back into that. And that's not to say it happens all the time, but we can just always, we have those moments. I mean, there's sometimes still where it's like, gosh, I've been out of this for over, like 20 years to almost 20 years. And I still sometimes am like that quiet little submissive, whatever. And it's not coming from a boundaried place. It's coming from a fawning place. So it can be really, really hard.
Yeah. So I've seen, like, you've made a lot of great posts concerning purity culture and like the physical and mental impacts it has. So I was wondering if we could specifically touch on some of, purity culture, I guess, like the definition for those who might not know. And then like some of the consequences of it and how it can how it can affect people later in life or currently in life. I know from your posts, like things I wouldn't even have thought of, and then you like write, the effects of purity culture. I'm just like check. Like, damn, I didn't even think about that. So let's talk about purity culture.
Well, I think it's important to note for the purpose of this conversation, we're talking about purity culture as it pertains to sexual purity, though I would tend to say purity cultures exist in a lot of different spaces that expand far beyond sexuality. But the way we learned about it was this idea of here is a very specific plan for for godly relationships that includes abstinence until marriage, very strict gender roles, rules around sexuality, sexuality mean like your inherent sexuality, like the passion, the motivation, who you have sexual relations with, like that's part of it, but very strict rules around that. And most people think like, oh, purity culture is just don't have sex before you're married. And if that was the case, I would be like, sure, cool. If you want to make that choice, that's great. And I still think if that's what you want to choose, fine. But purity culture is so much more than that, because it is all about controlling how a person exists in this world as a man or as a woman. And then every kind of aspect is defined. And I say as a man or as a woman because in purity culture, there are two genders and one sexual orientation that is accepted, cis and straight. So you're really put into these binary boxes and having to live your life from that. And if you grew up socialized female, there was a heavy burden that is placed on you to make sure that the men around you are living in a pure way. So that could be the things that you're dressing or what you're wearing, how you're even wearing your hair, what you say, what you do, having to be a very specific kind of prototype of a woman to make sure that the men around you are okay. So I don't have a succinct definition for what purity culture is. That's as succinct as I can make it. And then there's so many more layers that go into it.
Yeah. And it's like, I know personally, I was that person who like waited till marriage because, you sign on the dotted line of doing so, you save yourself for marriage. And when you're so immersed in the Christian side of things, so school, we did not have sex education. It was just purely abstinence. We didn't really even talk about what sex entailed. It was just like, don't do it.
But you're supposed to be amazing. Like when you can finally have it on your wedding night, it's supposed to be out of this world. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, like we were so sad.
It's just like you can't just shake that and overnight when your whole life you've just been told don't do that. Like this is bad. Yeah. So then you're expected to like enjoy your wedding. Are you for real? Yeah.
Traumatizing.
Right. It's like never mind like being gay or whatever, just at base level whether you're gay or not, right? It's not just gonna be this welcomed thing because your brain's gonna be like on fire. So like small tiny tangent is like it affected me so much that like after I got married we found out we had a little blip in our marriage license. Like I guess my friend signed on the wrong line or something, so it had to be like read, and I was like, oh my god, like we're not married. Like,
oh no,
that was like in my brain. Like I was like, oh like, oh no, did I sin?
Premarital sex.
Yeah. So like that's like how fucking anal I was about it, that I actually had this fear that like God was gonna be mad at me for that. And now I can laugh about it, but it's just like that's how deep it hits. Like even going to a basketball camp, and you can't even escape it at basketball camp. They still make you sign purity things. Like you have your little chapels every day, and that was part of it. And it's like at a fucking basketball camp, like for real, we can't just play basketball. We have to talk about purity. So like, you know, everything. Like I know how it's impacted me, but like mentally, especially for women, like what are some, you know, like physical side effects of purity culture? Because that's a thing.
Yeah, I mean, and there's even starting to be more and more research that's coming out around this. There are a lot of women that have that their lived experience, like the symptoms that they experience from purity culture, are kind of toe to toe with the symptoms that women who have experienced sexualized violence experience. So we're talking about in the physical, relational, psychological realm. And sexual realm as well. And so to kind of, before I go into that, you know, you mentioned something I think is worth noting is like the way our sexuality is supposed to kind of operate is that it grows over time as we grow as humans. There's a very developmental pieces of it. We are sexual beings from the moment that we are born until the moment that we die, right? And I look at it like a dimmer switch, one of those lights that you can kind of slowly turn up, right? And so you think about how a young child experiences their sexuality is different than a, you know, older child, adolescent, adult, you know, things like that. The hope is that as we grow as a human, like our sexuality grows with that, so that by the time we are an adolescent and we've got chemicals and hormones flooding our bodies, like there's a level of maybe cognitive knowledge that we know about what's going on. We have a bit of familiarity with our bodies because we've probably been experimenting a little bit on our own as a kid, just with pleasure, not in a sexual way, but just like, oh, this feels good. And they're not associating it with sexual pleasure, just general pleasure, right? So by the time we're an adolescent, it's like, oh, these things are turning on and I might want to be engaging with another human in that. And so that by the time that we are actually engaging in sexual activity, our bodies and minds are primed and prepped for that. It's kind of this natural transition into that. But when we are told, keep everything off, turn everything off, shut everything down, until this one very specific moment in this very specific context, it's like a light switch turning from off to on. And our bodies don't do well with it. It's the same thing that happens when children are sexually abused because their bodies are off and being turned on. They're having an experience that developmentally they should not be having. The same is true then for purity culture because it's been turned off, and so many people actually did do that, right? They've kept it off. They are now all of a sudden flipping that switch and they're having a developmental experience that they're not ready for because everything has been turned off. And when that happens, our bodies can often, not all the time, but often can register that as too much, too fast, too soon, which is, that definition of trauma, right? Our bodies have adverse reactions. And so we start to see things like sexual pain and dysfunction, vaginismus, erectile dysfunction. We see things psychologically like a ton of guilt and shame. I mean, everything that you said right there. We hypervigilance. We have relational issues, an inability maybe to communicate, hypervigilance to kind of everything that's going on around me. And so, and that over time can turn into other things like trauma, like, autoimmune disorders, gastrointestinal disorders, social phobias. The research is all coming there, and the anecdotal research then backs this up like tenfold, just that these are things that can happen as a result of purity culture. So it's so much more than just waiting to have sex before you're married. It is a total system of control over people's bodies, minds, sexuality, and their entire lives. And that doesn't necessarily ever lead to anything good.
Yeah, no, definitely not. It's like shame. Yeah. The shame is heavy, for heavy. Years, even after I feel like deconstruction, it's also not something that you can just flip a switch for. Right. So it's like, takes practice, like getting rid of that voice in your head. But Yeah, I think that's one of the big reasons like I feel so passionate about, even like women in religion still. There is a big piece of empathy, because it's just like I know the impacts it can have, and whether they're shouting at me that I'm going to hell. It's kind of like you kind of know where that came from, and what else they may believe and what else they might be going through. And it's not fun, and that's why I'm just like so passionate of like, do we have to like have kids go through this? It's not fun.
Yeah. I don't know if have you ever read Linda K. Klein's book, Pure?
I haven't, but I did go to one event that she put on. So
yeah, so it's interesting because she does a lot of interviews in the book, and it's really, really well done. And one of the people that she interviews is a pastor who, incidentally, is a pastor that I grew up with. He used to be a speaker at the camp that I grew up with. He was the cool youth pastor, so I always loved hanging out with him.
Starts with that.
Yeah. And out of all the pastors that she could have interviewed, she happened to interview Doug Pagitt, who is pretty well known as a very progressive Christian, kind of out there, pretty much excommunicated from like a lot of Christian communities, whatever. But Doug was somebody that I knew. And he made a statement in the book that when he was a youth pastor, which was during the height of all of this, and which is also when I would have known him, he and many other pastors knew that what was being taught through True Love Waits, through purity culture, was not the right way, was not the healthiest way, was not actually going to be effective. But they taught it anyways because they had nothing else to teach. Yeah. Like they didn't have other curriculum, and nobody wanted to do the work of putting that together. But he said, we knew it was wrong, and we did it anyways. And that was kind of like a burden that he was talking about carrying, and a guilt that he felt. There was something about that like really healed my adolescent self, to hear this pastor who directly had influence over me say, we got it wrong. And we actually knew we were getting it wrong, but we didn't do anything because we weren't really sure what to do. And it was wild to hear that. And I actually got a chance to re-meet Doug last year. I was at Wild Goose Fest, which is out in like a field in North Carolina. It's like so grossly hot or whatever. But we got a chance to talk about that. And it, again, just felt so redeeming that somebody recognized it. And it's sad though. That was really helpful for me, but it was also sad to go back and to know that he, along with so many other people, knew that it wasn't okay. And to know that there's also so many other pastors, probably even more so, that don't know that it's wrong and teach it because they do believe that this is the right way. I'm pretty good friends now with Josh Harris, who is, the poster child for purity culture. And I know and I trust him. And when he says like, I was passionate about this because I thought this was the right way, I believe him. Now he is very passionate on the other side of it now, but like in it, he was like, I absolutely believed this. And I believe him because I think it's all we had.
I mean, I believed it. It's what you're taught, and you just take it as gospel, as you think you should. So I feel like too, when you deconstruct, a lot of hesitation is the fact that you actually have to like own up to what you contributed as well. And that's never an easy pill to swallow, because it's like, oh yeah, I did judge people. I did have that like internalized homophobia that, you don't really realize at the time. And so it's like having to realize, oh, I might have caused like other people harm or damage or whatever. So it's like, I'm sure they carry a pretty heavy load with that, but it's definitely, admirable that they actually don't just keep doubling down and they admit, things they did wrong, which I feel like is so rare. And there's been a lot more, like documentaries regarding religion and its harms, and like Shiny Happy People, to name one. That was I loved that documentary.
Huge.
Very. And the one about what's his face in the big mega church. Gosh, it's totally just it's escaping me. You've probably seen it.
Trying to think.
Man, I can't remember.
Like Joel Osteen or
no, it's on Hulu. I don't know why.
Yeah, it's escaping me too. Hillsong.
Yes,
Hillsong.
I was like, it starts with H, but
yeah. Carl Lentz from Hillsong.
Yes. And it's just, I feel like more and more people are kind of waking up to it, and it's interesting that you still see people doubling down on it versus looking at it and being like, how can we do better? Like, what can we change? And it's like y'all would have like a lot less documentaries made about shit if you actually could take responsibility and change things. But it's very eye-opening to watch. I always watch them because I find it therapeutic and validating. But also, it can rile you up as well. But I almost wonder if some people would never deconstruct because it still serves them, as in like a lot of people don't until it hits them personally, like something stirs something up, and then you start getting those questions. So if like you're a cis straight man, you get all the benefits of staying where you're at. Like you benefit from it fully, so why would you deconstruct or think outside the box? Which is why I'm always like, any cis straight dude that deconstructs and like looks at everything, like, you're awesome, because you didn't have to. You could have just kept going, and you're fine. So
you thrive in that system. So
it's just like, is there ever going to be a time where the church changes? I mean, I know there's like a slow like trickle of progressive Christianity, but like it's just like, is that there's still so many underlying sameness, like the religion aspect of it. It's a little better because they're more inclusive and everything, and aren't so outwardly exclusive. But I don't know, like, is there hope for this whole, because I feel like with Christian nationalism, like, it's only growing. It's just like, is it just like the pendulum swinging to that side, whereas it kind of like in 2020 was disrupted and we had a lot more conversations? And is it just people are just like, we're doubling down harder, Satan is at work, we're being persecuted more now than ever? It's like, where do we go from here?
So maybe I'm being overly optimistic, but I do think that there's hope. And my hope does not come through Christ, but it comes through science. No, but if we look at, gosh, I cannot remember the author's name, but he writes the book called Family and Civilization. And it's either an anthropological or sociological study, maybe anthropological. I can't remember. Anyways, but this is years and years and years ago. And what he did is he started looking at the rise and the fall of, like, quote unquote superpower countries. And what is it that got them to this place of extreme power? And then what is the fall out of that? And the rise is patriarchy, getting them to this super, like, macho place, like, and everybody talks about that. The United States is the greatest nation in the world, and we're the most powerful nation in the world, and the president is the most powerful man, hopefully powerful woman in the world, right? Like, we have this mentality. But with that patriarchal construct comes a lot of rules and distress and inequality and dehumanization for pretty much everybody. And I think it's also worth noting that in patriarchy, nobody wins, even the people at the top of the ladder, right? There's not a way to actually win in a system like that, where we're all, competing for control. And so when they looked at the quote unquote fall of the superpower nation, there's like 10 different kind of factors that start to happen. And what we realize is that it's not actually a fall, it's that it's equality. And it's things like, regardless of your gender, you have equality. It's relationships shifting between parents and children, where children are valued as human beings rather than just like the, be silent and, don't speak until I say so. It's things like being able to engage with your sexuality in a way that is meaningful to you. And we see this happen, and it has happened in many, many other countries that are seemingly far more progressive than the United States. But they're also much, much older than we are as well. And they've already gone through this cycle. And it's certainly not to suggest that these countries are perfect and don't have issues. They absolutely do. But yet you see a general difference in how people are responding to other people in some of these countries because they've already gone through that cycle. And I say that because each of those cycles happens roughly in 400 years. And we're coming up on the end of that. We're coming up on that. And we are starting to see this jostling and jockeying for more control from the people that have been in the power positions, which they get bigger and louder and more extreme when they know that they're about to lose that. And I think that's what's happening now. And that's the only amount of hope that I can take is looking at it through the lens of history. And I don't know how long it's going to take. Things do move much faster now than they did, in the past. But I can see, and I think that in the United States, this election cycle is going to be very telling as to where the power truly is in terms of breaking over that line. And are we going to, quote unquote, fall as a nation, but really it's falling into equality.
Yeah, wow, that's interesting to think of it that way. Like where you got the far right being like, it's the end times. It's like, is it though? It's just the end of your ruling, maybe.
The end of an era.
Yeah. And it's funny too, because when you're taught about things in religion and what the Antichrist is going to seem like when they come or whatever, is Trump not like the spitting image of what we were taught? And they're like, nope, this is not the one. Just like, pretty sure if I still believed in that, I'd be like, Trump is the Antichrist. Like, it just fits perfectly in the description.
It fits perfectly. Yeah. Did you ever read the Left Behind books?
Oh, yeah. That's its own
I'm
trauma.
like, he's Nikolai Carpathia.
Yes.
Like the Antichrist.
Exactly. It's like, it's also wild thinking like that was a whole, there's the adult series and there was the kids series. And it's like, I read the kids series, but like, no wonder so like I was terrified because I didn't want to be left behind. It's like that's so mean to do to kids.
I know. Yeah, it really is. There's so many levels of fucked upness in all of this, and you're like, oh my gosh, like they don't want kids to see like sex scenes on TV, but we're like totally okay with talking about the mass destruction of the world and you being separated eternally from your parents. Like, please explain that to me, right? No, like, not okay.
And it's totally like a loving God that would do something like that, just leaving children behind because they weren't Christians or whatever. They didn't say the single prayer that just, does it all.
The magic words.
The magic words I felt I needed to do over and over just in case.
Over and over.
Like,
Yep. Yeah.
But have you seen the documentary Bad Faith? It's on Amazon Prime, I believe.
I don't know that I have. I'll have to look that up. Yeah. What's it about?
Christian nationalism. So
yes, it's on my queue. I just haven't had time to watch it. Yes, I want to.
Definitely watch that one. I watched that the other day, and it's very eye-opening. It gives a whole like history basically of how it kind of started and how long they've been working at even getting to where we're at. So pretty mind-blowing and angering. I don't know if my friend was on it, but I have a friend named Brad Onishi, and he is the co-host of the Straight White American Jesus podcast, which of course is a sarcastic title. However, it's amazing. I've learned so much, and really what they look at most often is the marriage of religion and politics, how we're seeing it show up. But he wrote a book called Preparing for War.
that released on January 6th of 2023,
Wow, okay.
which I thought was like so
Very
perfect. Yeah. I think that was on purpose. And then he also did this series called The Orange Wave on their podcast. And it was really looking at this rise of Christian nationalism that started back in the 50s and 60s, getting it to where it's at today. That was mind blowing because, of course, I never knew that, before this. I was just like, oh yeah, this is just how we grew up, right? We weren't taught this. We weren't taught that this was the 70-year long game or, whatever. It's like, we were just taught this was God's way. And yeah, it's so, on the one hand, it is like mind blowing, like, holy cow. And on the other hand, it's mind blowing, like, holy shit. Like, this is real and happening. And we need to be talking about it.
Yeah, most definitely, because it's like they've made slow and steady progress to the point where we're at. It's not going to stop anytime soon.
Yeah.
But so I don't want to keep you too much longer here, but I did want to ask one more. Have you seen Hail Satan?
No.
Okay, that one you should definitely check out.
I'm writing these down literally as we're talking. Okay, so documentaries. Bad Faith, and Hail Satan.
Hail Satan. So that one specifically, it's been around for a while. It's an older one, not like old, but I think I watched it in like 2019. So it's been around, and maybe it was released in 2018 or something. But essentially, it's about Satanism, but it essentially just goes about like Satanism exists to troll Christianity. They don't even believe in Satan.
Yeah.
And there's particular parts in the documentary where they're trying to get like a monument to like Satan put on like courthouse lawns or whatever next to the Ten Commandments that are there. But their thing is they don't want their monument to be there if the Ten Commandments are removed or something, because they're like, we don't want our like one religion to stand above all. We just want quality. And so they essentially just troll Christianity by following the rules and laws and being like, hey, you need to let all religions do the same thing if you're going to let Christianity. It's still very strange, but at the same time, genius.
I'm going to need to watch that. Yeah. Because, I grew up, my mother is an educator by, trade or whatever. She's a teacher, and education was very important in our house, which was great. It actually kept me from being homeschooled because my mom was a teacher, and, great. But I remember in my early years being taught that this nation was built on religious freedom, not Christian freedom, religious freedom. And I can't tell you the exact point that it shifted into, we are a Christian nation, this was founded on Christian beliefs. I don't remember when that point came, but I've always been so curious to I'm not going to get into this conversation with my parents, but be like, okay, so what was that shift for you, and why did that shift? Because that is not what you used to teach us. And I wish people would just, and now they are, like, now people are just saying, like, no, it's not religious freedom. It is Christian freedom. Like, I am a proud Christian nationalist, and I want everybody. And I'm like, I actually have more respect for you than I do these other people that are trying to, like, pass legislation and be like, no, this is just what's best for the country. But then they don't spread the equality to all religious groups. It's wild to me because it has changed in our lifetime. The move from we are a country based on religious freedom to we are a country that is a Christian nation. It's wild to me. Yeah.
And it's just like, I feel like the right side has just become this, how can we implement biblical stuff into our laws? That is not religious freedom. And they're just very adamant. If you watch the documentary, like, all the Christians are like, we are a Christian nation, like, as fact. It's like, no, that we are
No.
not.
No.
That is not true.
As fact, we are not.
Yeah, so it's like that always makes me so frustrated, and like, we are not. That's what you want to believe, but no.
Yeah.
But,
We literally founded this country to get away from religious nationalism.
exactly.
Like, hello? Yeah.
Yeah, and that's why they so specifically set things up the way they did,
Yeah.
so that
Yeah.
that didn't occur. But well,
Yeah.
people.
And I should say, we founded this country. We committed mass genocide
this
to found
country.
this country. To steal, we committed genocide in order to start this country to be away from religious tyranny. And now we're just back at it, doing it again.
Right.
Yeah.
It existed to the point where they built missions back in the day, and like basically slave labored people into believing in Jesus. It's just like, so they are still doing the same shit all these years later. It's all about the love of God, I'm sure. Okay.
So
but
bad. So bad.
Anyways, I don't want to keep you too long.
Yeah.
I know you are a very busy person, but did you have any like last things you wanted to say, or where people can find you and stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll plug my book in a second where you can find me, but like the whole point of my book was talking about the healing aspect, that you can heal. And I believe that healing is a lifelong process, not so that you're like, oh my God, I've got to go to therapy the rest of my life, but meaning that like healing is this process that we do in the little tiny moments, making different choices, having different responses, leaning into relationship, things that are, different than how we grew up, and handling triggers in very different ways. And, I really believe that the point of healing and doing all of this work is to actually live. And I think that that's possible, which sounds maybe simple, but also profound given where we've come out of, where the whole point of living was to get to heaven. And so I just love encouraging people to like live this life. This is the one life that we have, and you live as a healing person in every moment of every day. And it's possible. It's possible to enjoy. It's possible to experience pleasure and relationship and all the good things. You experience all the difficult things too as we fully live. It's grief and sadness and frustration and being irate at people for different political things. It's all in there, but it is possible. And if you're just at the beginning parts of this process, like it will get better eventually. It is really hard. There is nothing wrong with you. You are not broken. You can trust yourself. There are people here to support you, and there will be a point where things start to feel a little bit easier.
Yeah, that's definitely good to know.
Yeah. Yeah. So, my book can be purchased anywhere that people buy books. It's called When Religion Hurts You: Healing from Religious Trauma and the Impact of High Control Religion. Anywhere that you want to buy it, or you can request it at your local library or go to your local bookstore. They can all get it. I'm on all social media platforms at Dr. Laura E. Anderson, and that's my website also. And then my company is the Center for Trauma Resolution and Recovery, and we work with clients literally all over the world to resolve and recover from all of this stuff that we've been talking about today. So our website is traumaresolutionandrecovery.com, and you can schedule a free inquiry call with any of our practitioners. You can also follow us on social media at Trauma Resolution and Recovery.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on. Always love talking to you about religious trauma.
Yes.
So
yes.
Yeah.
It's always
if you're
so
ever,
amazing.
You're always welcome to come back whenever
thank
you're very
you.
busy. But yeah, we'd love to have you on.
Yeah.
More than just one time, but
well, just let me know. I'll be back.
Sounds good. All right, that's it for today, guys. Thanks so much for listening. I will talk to you next time.